And the stuff-ups at ABC Promo's department pale beside this one.
Apology to the Prime Minister. An article in today's The Australian reported that Prime Minister Julia Gillard had set up a trust fund for her then-boyfriend 17 years ago. This is wrong.
In 1992, Julia Gillard helped her boyfriend, Bruce Wilson, Victorian Branch Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, to set up an incorporated association. The Workplace Reform Association was allegedly a sham used by Wilson, without Gillard's knowledge, to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars into his own pocket and that of his crony Ralph Blewett. But an association is not the same as a trust fund. It's not the first time that News Limited papers have made minor errors with major consequences in covering this long-running saga. It's happened at least once before, almost exactly a year ago.
The Australian published today an opinion piece by Glenn Milne, which includes assertions about the conduct of the Prime Minister. The Australian acknowledges these assertions are untrue.
Media Watch covered that debacle at length at the time. Glenn Milne alleged that
Gillard shared a home in Fitzroy, bought by Wilson using the embezzled funds.
But she didn't. She may have stayed in the house on occasion, but she didn't share it. Again, it might seem to you a trivial error, but it enabled a furious Julia Gillard to stop the Australian and the Herald Sun's Andrew Bolt from pursuing the matter, at least for a while. As a direct result of that column, Glenn Milne lost his job as a columnist for The Australian and his gig as a regular panellist on the ABC's Insiders programme. And there was another casualty. Michael Smith, the afternoon host of Fairfax Media's Sydney radio station 2UE. Smith had tried and failed to air an interview about Bruce Wilson's scam and Julia Gillard's alleged involvement with a former president of the Victorian AWU, Bob Kernahan. Smith lost his job, but has pursued the issue relentlessly. A month ago, he gave his version of events to Alan Jones on rival station 2GB.
10 minutes before I was due to go to air, after having recorded an interview with the former head of the union, Bob Kernahan, after having that exhaustively checked legally over the weekend, a senior executive in Fairfax from Melbourne telephoned and said, "You're not to broadcast it." And you have to wonder, Alan, as to what influence was brought to bear.
Michael Smith has insisted to us that the interview was backed by documentation and was cleared by a senior defamation lawyer. Graham Mott, the Fairfax radio executive who stopped the interview, now retired, stands by his statement of last year that it was not cleared. Was influence brought to bear? Well, as recently as last week, 2GB's Ben Fordham, introducing another interview with Michael Smith, claimed this.
But what's interesting is the way that the PM's office and the PM herself have tried to smother this story, scaring the life out of anyone who dare mention it. When Michael Smith raised the issue on 2UE last year, he ended up losing his job.
We asked Graham Mott this week whether he or anyone else at Fairfax had been contacted about Smith's broadcasts by the Prime Minister's office. His response?
No.
We got the same answer from Greg Highwood, CEO of Fairfax Media. Both responses are on our website. Of course, we haven't heard Smith's interview with Bob Kernahan, but we have seen Kernahan's statutory declaration, which went viral on the internet at the time. It contains allegations about Julia Gillard that we don't believe could be substantiated. And we're not alone in that judgment. Shortly after Smith was taken off air, an article appeared in the Weekend Australian. It reported that Mr. Kernahan had had help in drawing up his stat deck.
Pauline Hanson's former senior advisor, John Pasquarelli, helped produce and distribute a former union official's statutory declaration. It is understood that the involvement of Mr. Pasquarelli, an avowed far-right winger who despises Ms. Gillard, was not known to the Prime Minister's office.
The reporter who dug out that fascinating tidbit for the Oz was
Hedley Thomas.
Yes, the Oz's gun investigative reporter responsible for most of last week's coverage of the Gillard-Wilson affair. Back in September, Thomas concluded,
The Weekend Australian has examined thousands of pages of documentation and conducted numerous interviews. None of the material examined is capable of supporting the claims that Ms. Gillard was a beneficiary of ill-gotten funds. or that she knew at the time that Mr Wilson was involved in alleged fraud.
It's a judgment that, after all Thomas's reporting in recent days, still stands. Not that, of course, has stopped numerous websites and blogs recycling such claims about Julia Gillard, often in the most scurrilous terms. Compared to many of them, Michael Smith is a model of integrity and good sense. There's a growing divide in the media in Australia and worldwide, well summarised by the Sydney Morning Herald's Phil Curry on Late Line last week. On one side, he said, are mainstream news outlets.
Where we're still bound by things like defamation and libel laws, we still have to strive to be seen objective and have balanced stories and try and write news rather than opinion. And then you have essentially not every blogger, but you have people like Larry Pickering and stuff who just can fly off the handle and say what they like and dress it up and put a bit of licence in it and just go for it. And they operate on a completely different plane now.
Political cartoonist Larry Pickering has been one of the chief stirrers of the Gillard-Wilson pot. His blogs and emails contain a mix of fact, allegation, rumour and fantasy, not to mention some truly revolting cartoons. So when 9 days ago the Weekend Australian published this front-page story...
Revealed! Gillard lost her job after law firm's secret investigation. Hedley Thomas.
Julia Gillard deliberately conflated it with the campaign in the blogosphere. On Sky News next morning, she refused to answer questions about the Hedley Thomas story.
Well, I am not going to get into a circumstance where we've got people blogging malicious nonsense and we're having some of this penetrate into the media.
Many mainstream political reporters and commentators sympathised, including one of her interviewers that Sunday morning, Sky's Peter Van Onselen.
I believe you that you did nothing wrong. I made a comment on Friday on my show, The Contrarians, that I thought that this is all a beat-up and that we should move on to the major issues.
ABC Melbourne Radio's John Fain agreed.
The conspiracy theorists are having a ball. The blogosphere is running amok. It's all completely out of control. Why is it on the front page of the paper? Well, I just have to tell you, I don't understand it either.
Most outspoken of all was Crikey's Bernard Keane. He dismissed Hedley Thomas's article as no more than...
vague claims recycled from right-wing hate blogs.
Well, I think that's nonsense. Hedley Thomas's first story 9 days ago reported that a former senior partner of Slater and Gordon claimed that
Julia Gillard left her job as a partner with law firm Slater and Gordon as a direct result of a secret internal probe in 1995 into controversial work she had done for a then-boyfriend, a union boss accused of corruption.
That was news from a primary source. He disclosed that Julia Gillard had understood the real purpose of the Workplace Reform Association she helped establish was
to hold re-election funds for union officials contributed by individual union members and fundraisers. She stated it was referred to as a re-election or slush fund.
That was news. And it disclosed that
Ms Gillard had confirmed that she did not open a file at the firm to establish the association, and that she could not, at the time, recall any reason why a file was not opened.
And so on. You can question the motive of the Australian as it filled page after page with detail that few will read. But Hedley Thomas's articles were, for the most part, sober and meticulous, and for the first time, perhaps, showed how much of the ranting in the blogosphere had substance and how much did not. And then a careless mistake was made by a colleague writing an incidental colour piece about Bruce Wilson in Thursday's paper.
17 years ago, after Slater and Gordon grilled his lawyer girlfriend Julia Gillard about a trust fund she'd set up for him, up-and-coming Labor leader Bruce Wilson knew one of them had to ride off into the sunset.
If Ian Higgins had written slush fund and put it in inverted commas, the Prime Minister could not have complained. They were the words she'd used to describe the Workplace Reform Association to her colleagues in 1995. As it was, she was able to imply that thousands of words of largely accurate reporting were false and defamatory. But it was too late to do what she did last year and use the mistake to gag the Australian. Instead, she did the opposite.
In these circumstances where I am seeing recycled again false and defamatory material attacking my character, I have determined that I will deal with these issues.
It's what many felt she should have done weeks, if not years ago. Most agreed that she did a remarkable job. Not everyone will be satisfied, as she knows perfectly well.
Will the misogynists and the nut jobs on the internet continue to circulate them? Yes, they will. And it wouldn't matter what I said, and it wouldn't matter what documents were produced, and it wouldn't matter what anybody else said. They will pursue this claim for motivations of their own which are malicious and not in any way associated with the facts.
But to my mind, there are two lessons for the mainstream media to be drawn from this long-running saga. The first is that when you're attacking a Prime Minister, it really is a good idea to get everything right. And the second is that thorough, professional, accurate reporting on issues like this that otherwise fester in the murk of the internet is a good thing, not a bad one. It's what journalists ought to do.